Okay, this is Unit 10.3 or Section 10.3. We're talking about Russia in the latter part of the 19th century, going into the 20th century a little bit. Piper just got excited. Oh, she's okay. All right, so we're going to look at a lot of stuff. This is a big section. There's a lot going on in Russia before things get crazy in the 20th century that are important to understand in this section. So it's very important that you get some good ideas about what's happening as Russia develops and the challenges that the Russians face, maybe more so than any other country in Europe. So Russia out of the shadows sounds like a James Bond movie. And speaking of James Bond, your man up there in the top right, he's going to show up several times. So enjoy his presence. First thing we're going to look at is a war in the first part of the second half of the 19th century. It's called the Crimean War, taking place where much of world events have kind of occurred here in the last couple of years in what's called the Crimean Peninsula. And it's going to involve Russia, obviously, we put it in this section, and also the Ottoman Empire, but other countries get involved as well. The big thing about this war to know, first of all, is the Concert of Europe, which was basically your conservative governments in Europe banding together against internal enemies, not so much each other. That's going to be put to rest here. So you're going to see European countries again fighting each other, but granted, this is not a major European war. It's just more of a regional war with other countries involved. So keep that in mind, but the Concert of Europe is DED, dead. Okay, Crimea River. That's one of my worst jokes. But anyway, so here's the story. Here's what's going on. Russia considers themselves as the protectors of Orthodox Christians who live in the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire is Muslim. So Russia traditionally considers itself the guardian or protector of these Orthodox Christians, which is basically cousins of the Catholic Church, for those that live in what is considered the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire is receding, right? It's going backwards. Now, remember, they lost Greece. They've been receding out of Europe since the late 17th century. And now, again, they're going to be in the fire here. But it's because Orthodox Christians were being persecuted in the Ottoman Empire. So Nicholas I, who's your czar after Alexander I, who was the guy at Vienna, Nicholas I sends Russian troops to occupy the Crimean Peninsula and to attempt to try and protect these Orthodox Christians. Well, basically the Ottomans get a little upset with the Russian troops moving in, so the Turks or the Ottomans declare war on Russia. And basically that's kind of the story. So now you've got Russia and you've got the Ottoman Empire squaring off in a war. Now, what's interesting here is that Russia is starting to maybe expand their influence to the south. Some people consider maybe the real reasons for this war is not so much for religious reasons, but maybe some strategic reasons in gaining land and perhaps expanding influence. So, that might be something that the British and the French, who themselves are looking to expand a bit, more on imperialism later, but Britain and France join in to support the Ottoman Empire against the Russians. It should be noted that the Russians ask Austria and Prussia to jump in and help them, but Austria and Prussia say, no siree, they do not jump in at all. So basically, you've got the Ottoman Empire, which is certainly not a strong power anymore, but helped by Britain and France, both, very solid themselves, against Russia. 3-on-1, it's not going to work very well. Alexander II, who becomes Tsar when his dad, Nicholas I, dies in 1856. I think it's his dad, not too sure. It doesn't really matter. But he's going to end the war, so it doesn't really go well for Russia. And at this peace treaty, Russia is the big loser. They are the biggest loser at this treaty after the war is over. Russia has to give up all the territories that they have in the Middle East, which is not a whole lot. And the protection of the Ottoman Empire is ensured. Now, it's not really going to be a good thing here for the Ottoman Empire because basically they couldn't have won the war without Russia's help. But this war does influence and emphasize something big about Russia, a very big weakness. The amount of factories in industrialization that Russia has during this war could be summed up with the number 0. Okay? That's it. That's all. They don't have the ability to wage war and move goods from place to place in a quick way, in a fast way. And it's very clear to this new Russian Tsar Alexander II that Russia has got to change, that Russia has got to adapt, or Britain and France will leave it behind, and probably even Prussia and Austria to that matter. So Russia has got to change. And that's the big message for the Crimean War, is that Russia has to adapt to this new life, this new technology. They have to industrialize. They have to build railroads. Russia is not invincible anymore. It used to be that big bad bear in the east, and Napoleon certainly had his troubles conquering, but Russia just cannot win anymore by playing its old 16th and 17th century game. It's going to have to adapt. Okay, so a couple things from the war, just of note. Russia's woes, we basically just talked about that, where Russia really is sucky. And they're going to have to figure itself out industrially to be able to compete. Two other notes just of interest. Florence Nightingale, you might have known or seen or heard the name before, a British nurse who became a pioneer in modern nursing during this war. Nightingale and her kind of group that she headed up, they actually went out to tend to wounded men on the battlefield. Her group is actually called the Light Brigade, and if you've ever heard of Alfred Lord Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, it kind of shows and illustrates this heroic nature of this war from the British angle, certainly. And Nightingale was a part of that, bringing women's contributions during warfare to something that had never seen before. Usually the women stay home, but Nightingale and her Light Brigade are basically tending to wounded men during the war. Many people still die due to disease and things like that, but they're actually helping with that. And then perhaps something that's going to change the way that countries perceive war forever is that the media now, for the first time, can get images of the battlefield to show their readers back home. People come around here, this guy, Hoscat right here, right in his little photographic van where he can develop photographs in the dark room in that van. Basically, this guy can open the eyes of the world to warfare. What does war look like? We don't know. 30 years war. Who knows what that looks like? Well, if you're not there, you don't know. There's no way to record that outside of, illustrations or drawings. But now people can get real pictures. As the photograph, the daguerreotype had been developed in the early 1800s. Now it's being put to use to show people, hey, here's what war is like. And war will never be seen the same way again because people can now see what war really is. Okay, so basically where we are, we're in the year 1860. The United States is about to fight a civil war. Otto von Bismarck is coming to power in Prussia, but Russia is turning the page. Alexander II of the Romanov family. Remember, we got our Romanovs here. It's basically the same family of czars in a very, very conservative state. Again, to remember about Russia, this is a very conservative country. But Alexander II realizes, I'm going to have to change the way Russia looks if we are to compete as a nation state against our rivals. All right, so let's look at Alexander II. Becomes Tsar of the year 1855, Peace Treaty 1856, and basically heads up Russia in this period of change. He's going to trigger industrialization by building railroads. That's the best way to kind of get things going, get things moving, is build railroads, especially in Russia. I mean, Russia's not small. You got to move things place to place. It's going to take a lot of work to be able to do it. And he believed that building railroads to link up factories would be the best way of doing such a thing, and you really can't argue with him. Between 1860 and 1880, railroad mileage in Russia grew from 1,250 miles to over 15,000 miles. Industrial suburbs grew up around Moscow and St. Petersburg. Russia was now starting to take the looking, that's a terrible grammatic phrase, whatever, started to look like Oh, okay, we're good. It started to look like a industrialized country a little bit, but again, it's so big and it's so hard to do, and to connect the whole country together. But in terms of trying to progress Russia into the future, big moment in 1861. Alexander II declares that all serfs in Russia are to be freed. It's called the Emancipation Act. Ironically, 2 years before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, Alexander II issues the Emancipation Act in 1861. He really believed that hey, where are we going to get our factory workers? If these guys are tied to the land they're working, if they're basically in glorified slavery to the nobles, the boyars who work there, who own the lands, then we're not going to have people to be able to work. So he frees the serfs in part that the peasants and these rural poor can move to cities and then serve as a working class. That's the idea. Now, there were a couple of, let's say, consequences for that action. Remember the serfs, let's call them peasants now, basically. They're no longer dependent on the lord or the boyar to tell them what to do, what to grow, what to do, ever. They're free to move around, to change occupations, to get a job and things like that. But here's the problem. Russia has no middle class. And until Alexander II comes around, there's really no developing middle class. So there's not a whole lot of jobs out there in factories. As they kind of build up, the jobs come open, but it's a very slow process. So many of these peasants have no choice but to stay on the land or around the land where they work. Granted, they're not legally tied to being taxed by a boyar. They don't have to give a part of the yield of the harvest. They don't have to do that, but there's still very little freedom. So many of these Russian peasants live in these things called mirs. They're highly regulated communes of people living together, collective ownership, responsibility. It's basically a little community where people could live off the land together, work together. This is very Britain 17th century, 18th century, but we're in the middle of the 1800s, the middle of the 19th century, and Russia's kind of going through this. Really, they don't have anywhere to go outside of living on the land because, again, it's very, very rural. Still not a lot of jobs out there. And then you also have in these mirs, in these areas, you have these things called zemstvos, whatever. And these are basically little governments that allow people in these communities to get involved. Instead of the boyars running everything, now people can get involved in the government a little bit. Sure, the boyars that are around still control these popular assemblies, but it's certainly not a dictatorial setting that maybe it was under the serfdom model. Let's see. I think that's all. So... Oh, another thing with this to chart is that because of this kind of more, hey, I'm a former serf, now I'm living in one of these mirs, and I have a little voice in my government. People started to think, well, instead of these local assemblies which decide things, why don't we have a national assembly? People in Russia, they called it the Duma. Okay, the Duma basically is a parliament or a congress, and they're like, well, if we can do this, if we can speak our mind here on the local level, why can't we have a national Duma to be able to do the same thing and rule concurrently with our czar? Perhaps that's a good idea. Well, Alexander II, as time went on, started to see that maybe his actions were beginning to trigger the growth of liberal ideas. We're talking about sharing power in government. We're talking about the growth of the middle class a little bit in Russia, certainly not a lot. But now things are starting to push back a little bit on this czar. As he modernizes Russia, it comes with a price. So he becomes more and more conservative as he gets older. And as fear basically of losing power due to all of this change. So he's not willing to say, okay, we're going to modernize, but with that, we're not going to modernize the government. I want to keep it that way. But it was really, really inescapable that's going to happen or come along with it. So there are a couple things that basically came along with that. Um, I'm not so much going to go into these two terms. I think they're very minor. You can kind of look them up. I think the book discusses them a little bit, but perhaps they'll play a role later. And anyway, here's what happens. 1881. Again, Alexander is getting more and more conservative as he gets older. He's riding in his carriage in St. Petersburg, and a group of Poles, Poles meaning Polish people, who desire home rule for Polish independence from Russia, track him down and take a homemade bomb, basically, perhaps a stick of dynamite or something like that. I'm not sure exactly, perhaps a grenade. But anyway, they pack snow around it. And they take these snow bombs and throw it at the carriage, and the carriage explodes. And everyone goes flying up. It looks very much like this. Okay, see, I mean, this is a terrible picture, but basically the snow explosion here in St. Petersburg, and people are blown to bits, basically, but the Tsar is not killed. The Tsar is actually taken back to the Winter Palace, which is basically, again, the Versailles of Russia, and he's sitting on his bed. The picture here in the previous post or the previous slide showed this. He's laying on his bed. He's dying, and he calls all of his family in there. He calls his son Alexander. He's going to be Alexander the Third here in a minute. He brings them in, and his last words, he tells his people that tells his family that the people have betrayed him, that his story has gone south because the people have sought to outthink and to unseat him from his position of power, and that the people must pay. And it was interesting because Alexander at this point was planning or thinking about putting in a Duma or a legislative body. But those plans are canceled as Alexander on his deathbed tells his family that the people must pay for their sins against the royal family. So it's just an epic kind of an ending. So, revenge, basically. Alexander the Third. Does not rule for long. He's only about 13 years. He looks a lot like Coach O'Buck, who used to coach at Madison Central. I know you can see it right there. There he is. He is probably the most reactionary czar, meaning that this guy is conservative. You can't see the rest of it, but I promise you it's there. He is conservative. This guy is basically going to try to eliminate all diversity, eliminate all differences, eliminate all freedoms. Again, maybe I'm over-dramatizing that moment with his dad, but still you can imagine how tough that was for him to kind of take that and see his father die. So he encourages this idea called Russification in the Russian Empire. And Russia, like Austria, owns and controls many different ethnic groups like the Poles and different Slavic people in the southwest of the Russian Empire. And he tells them that everyone must adopt Russian principles and Russian customs. He also leads many of these things called pogroms, which we may talk about on the next slide. I can't remember. But pogroms are basically organized anti-Semitism against Jewish people. Jews were actually blamed for the assassination of Alexander II instead of the Polish people. So there are a lot of different movements and campaigns of violence. Alexander III also did oversee many and massive periods of industrialization, again, as Russia attempts to grow and attempts to become more and more industrialized. But again, with industrialization comes the growth of a middle class, comes the growth of liberalism as well. So it's something to keep in mind. Okay, and just a little aside, and this is something we'll talk about a little more. The idea of anti-Semitism in European society did not start with the Holocaust. It did not start with Adolf Hitler. We've seen several times this semester that Jews have been blamed irrationally for different events that had happened, and there had been many times where Jews had been restricted from achieving different civil rights. Well, that does not end. And in Russia during this period is probably, arguably, the worst time for the Jewish people up in Europe up until, of course, the Holocaust. But there was a man named Theodor Herzl who led and started the idea of Zionism. In that he believed that the Jewish people needed a home. They needed a place that they could call home, a national state. Remember the idea of nationalism, that every ethnic group, every culture has their own self-defined political boundaries. Herzl believed that the Jewish people had theirs in the Holy Land in the Middle East, of where, of course, where Israel is today. That's where he wanted to go. But at this point, that was not something that was very possible at the time. He kind of discusses the idea with the head of the Ottoman Empire. That does not seem to be a possibility. He actually appeals to the British on his behalf, and the British tell him that, hey, we've got this land down in the middle of Africa. It's called Uganda. Maybe we can put you there. But Herzl's like, no, not feeling that one. So basically, his quest is not achieved during his life, but it's something to follow as we go forward, is that Herzl's efforts to give the Jews a national state free of persecution in Central and Eastern Europe, that's something to watch going forward. And then Alexander III dies, only 13 years on the throne, and then I believe his son, whose name is Nicholas II, becomes the Tsar. We will talk at length about this guy a little bit later on as we approach something very, very different in Russia. But Nicholas II, really the first thing that he gets Russia involved with is he gets Russia into a war with the Japanese Empire. Now, we've talked almost probably, I can't remember ever talking about Japan. We'll talk about them a little bit going forward, but Japan's been hanging out in the East, not really doing much. But they have started to become quite the naval power and regional power in Central and Eastern Asia. Nicholas II gets Russia involved over some disputes over land on the eastern side of Russia, in which they were trying to kind of move into Manchuria, a region of China, and also into Korea. And they thought that they could defeat what they considered a backward Asian country very easily. But remember, in wars, it is hard for Russia to move things around. It's so spread out, there's not really a ton of railroad to compensate for that. So Russia basically gets their butt kicked. And it is a very humiliating defeat as the Russians get destroyed by the Japanese in this war. That presence of war and those difficulties lead people at home in Western Russia, primarily Moscow, St. Petersburg, to question their government's leadership. And they also question the state of many people in the country. They're hungry. They're cold. It's Russia. These things happen. So, people get mad. And we have what's called the Revolution in 1905, which is encompassed mostly in this event called Bloody Sunday. Now, you can probably imagine what's on the menu for Bloody Sunday, but here's how this breaks down. You get 200,000 workers and peasants marching on the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They're singing hymns. They're singing church songs. They are not a threatening group. And they walk up and they're protesting and wanting these changes, these reforms in government, but they're doing so peacefully. Well, Nicholas II is out of town. He's not even in St. Petersburg. But his guard were. And they open fire on this group of people, and around 1,000 people die as the blood, the red blood, most people's blood is red. This blood just seeps into the white snow, and it shows just the disconnect between the Tsar and his people. And people are like, what is going on? We need change. Even though we've industrialized a little bit, the people of Russia are struggling. They have no representation in government. This is a difficult situation. So, Nicholas II, who of course is heartbroken by this event, creates what's called the Duma. And again, that's more of your Congress, your parliament structure. And he also grants freedoms of speech, assembly, and press. So he gives all these things to the Russian people as kind of a I'm sorry, this won't happen again thing from Bloody Sunday. However, the Tsar Basically, when he starts to work with the Duma, figures out, well, this Duma is going to be kind of difficult. Well, he has the ability, like in England, to dismiss the Duma, so he does that and never calls them back. So, well, and it was a nice try, but it doesn't really work out. I don't know why this little bear is here. It's really cute, though. Bears really get mean when they grow up, but when they're babies, the cubs are really cute. It's just like the Cubs baseball team. They try, not well, but they do what they can, and that's basically what the Russians were doing here. They tried, they did what they could, but the Tsar's going to have full power, and you just have to deal with the idea. So basically, the end story here is, and all of this action here on this slide basically goes to say that Russia is big. Its economic problems are big. Its disconnect between the Tsar and the people is big. And the chances that a bourgeoisie class, a middle class, will develop to become a liberal power in Russia against the ultra-conservative Tsar is small. It's not going to happen. So big changes are going to have to occur. Russia's size and climate present certain problems. And history suggests that the Tsar will reign, that democracy is not a possibility, that even representative democracy or constitutional monarchy are even difficult to have. There's going to have to be kind of a change, and it can't come slowly because Russia's tried, but you've seen this past 50 or so years that the Tsar is just not ready to give up his power. And that was true of Alexander II, of Alexander III, and now Nicholas II. So as we go forward, we're going to see, can Russia adapt, or will it be forced to change? Again, sorry for the length of this one, but again, Russian history, pretty important, and we're going to talk a lot more about it coming up. So again, those themes that I just went through, very important to kind of have in the back of your mind as we see Russia head into judgment time, or the Twilight Zone, or whatever you want to call it. And I thought we would end with this because, come on, can you beat it? I mean, Vlad on a Ritz cracker. It's just the best thing. I couldn't get the GIF. It was very sad, but we'll just have to deal with what we have. So, again, thanks for hanging in there, and we will see you soon.